Now, the evidence that you heard during this trial shows that plaintiff cannot and will not meet her burden of proof. She cannot prove that Michael Johnson had cancer that started in his lung because he was not worked up. And no workup means no proof of where his cancer began. That's important. He refused workup. And because he was never worked up, where his cancer began was never determined. Therefore, you should answer no to question 1 on the verdict form. Now, this morning, Mr. Acosta went through some excerpts from some of the plaintiff's medical records. The plaintiff wants you to believe that they can meet their burden of proof by showing some of Mr. Johnson's medical records that say probable lung cancer or likely lung cancer, but a medical record saying probable lung cancer or likely lung cancer does not mean there is a greater than 50% chance that Michael Johnson's cancer started in his lung. That's not what a differential diagnosis is. Now, Dr. Barron talked to you about differential diagnosis when he was here this past medicine. Nothing on a differential list, meaning the different sites where a cancer could have started, is 50% or more until and unless you have workup. And remember our funnel? He told you that in our funnel, Michael Johnson stayed at the top of the funnel. Initial presentation, beginning workup, because that's all he ever had. Where his cancer began was never diagnosed. Dr. Barron talked to you about how a differential diagnosis works, how a cancer is diagnosed, how a cancer started is found out by doctors. He told you that doctors determine where a cancer starts by creating a list of potential sites based on the patient's symptoms, based on how the patient initially presents. And then the doctors perform additional tests like blood work, x-rays, CT scans, MRIs, and biopsies to determine the primary site. But Dr. Barron told you that Mr. Johnson never left the top phase of that funnel, the top section of that funnel. He never went through the differential diagnosis process because he was never worked up. He refused medical workup. And we showed you the evidence of Mr. Johnson refusing medical workup. It's all in his medical records. The medical records tell the story. It begins, or where I'm going to begin, is November 6th. This is right after Mr. Johnson had his biopsy and found out there was cancer in the lung, but where the cancer began, the pathologist didn't know, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The record says, Mr. Johnson has declined to have his blood work done, has declined to have further x-ray studies done, and at present has declined to allow chemotherapy or radiation therapy. His wife, as well as his brother, are aware of his wishes and wish to concur with those wishes. They requested no further evaluation. 3 days later, and this is Dr. Boatwright, Mr. Johnson's cancer doctor. 3 days later, on November 9th, 1995, what does Dr. Boatwright tell us? He tells us, at present, he has not completed his evaluation. He says, I have not completed my evaluation in order to make an appropriate recommendation for treatment of his cancer. In declining appropriate staging studies and laboratory evaluation, as he is doing, we will not be able to make appropriate recommendations for his care. What happens next? November 13th, 1995, and Ms. Parker showed you a portion of this record, and this is probably the most important medical record in this case. This record tells you all you need to know about Michael Johnson's lack of workup and the consequences that that has, that they were never able to determine where his cancer began. Let's look at this record closely. First paragraph, follow-up of his carcinoma, which is at present felt to be most likely a lung cancer, though we are not certain of his primary site. Dr. Boatwright is saying there he does not know where Michael Johnson's cancer started. The next piece, Michael Johnson, he is aware that without further studies, we cannot be more specific about his tumor type. Dr. Boatwright is saying he cannot be more specific about his tumor type. And the next piece is very important, and that a very treatable and potentially curable tumor may be missed. A very treatable and curable tumor. Mr. Acosta told you this morning that cigarette smoking is diagnostic of lung cancer. Not according to Dr. Boatwright. Dr. Boatwright knew that Michael Johnson was a cigarette smoker, but he did not know where his cancer began. And he was worried about a potentially treatable, a very treatable and potentially curable cancer being missed at this time. You heard testimony, there are hundreds of cancers. Cancers can start anywhere in the body, and Dr. Boatwright is saying, I don't want to miss one that I can treat and cure. Now, it goes on. Both his wife and brother were present for this discussion, and both urged him to have further evaluation. Important point there. They're not trying to force him into treatment. That's not treatment yet. That's evaluation. Let's just find out what this is. But he won't even do that. Goes on. Michael Johnson is adamant in his conviction not to have further evaluation done. You don't get to treatment before evaluation. You have to know where the cancer started and how far it spread before you can treat it. It hasn't even been evaluated yet. Dr. Boatwright does not know where the cancer started.